Okay, we'll get started. I think we're running already a little bit behind time, so I don't want to take too much time away. I'm Tom Scheinfeldt from the University of Connecticut, and I'm very pleased to be here today introducing this great panel. On the screen now is a Twitter conversation that I had last evening in the airport with one of our panelists. And I was thinking about the meanings of interoperability for this panel. And James tweeted back that he said, I've got an interoperability PowerPoint if needed, but I think I'm supposed to talk about sustainability. And I tried to reassure him, tweeting back saying, nope, I'm thinking about interoperability as a component of sustainability. And he wrote back, that almost makes it sound as if wasting scarce resources isn't a good idea. And I told him that. He just gave me my opening line. So there it is. But I think there's a serious truth in this joking exchange, and I think we heard some of that in the last panel. That interoperability, I think, really is our clearest path to a sustainable cultural heritage and public information infrastructure. And so whether that interoperability is about federated search and discovery, or linked open data, or open source software, or consortial revenue models, the things we'll hear from our panelists today, building the national digital platform is ultimately about sustaining local investments. And I think that's where we get to some of the concerns that were voiced in the question and answer in the last period. The critique, I think, that's been levied against this idea of the national digital platform is that it runs the risk, as I think Amy and Brewster both hinted at, of isolating and alienating local institutions and neglecting their needs in pursuit of some larger national all-encompassing vision and program. But I think that critique will only prove correct if we focus too much emphasis on the first word in the program, the national, and not enough emphasis on the third word, platform. And ultimately, the national digital platform will succeed only if, by creating an interoperable ecosystem, we heard that word, ecosystem of tools, services, data, and organizations, that is a platform, only if that platform allows local institutions to avoid the kind of giant resource suck of digital services and tools that could be better provided at a distance, and instead focus their resources, their energy, their staff expertise on the things that can only be done locally. So I don't think it's an either or. I think it's allowing local institutions to do what they do best and allowing a national ecosystem or shared ecosystem. And maybe national is the problem word there. Maybe we want to talk more about a shared infrastructure or a shared platform or a shared ecosystem. Allowing that shared ecosystem to do the work that can be done by us all. And so it really is an issue of sustainability. It's about allowing local institutions to use their resources best and not duplicate effort for digital programs that may be really outside of their scope, outside of their resources, outside of their expertise. So I think that keeping our eye on this most important goal of the National Digital Platform, kind of local cultural sustainability, is our real challenge here today, and I think that was voiced very well in the last session. And so we're going to hear from each of our panelists this morning their responses to that challenge and how they're meeting those challenges in different ways. So let me introduce them quickly. I was told just to do names and titles, so I'll do that. Dan Cohen, immediately to my right, is Executive Director of the Digital Public Library of America. I think everyone here probably knows what that does. Evelyn McClellan is President of Artefactual Systems, which develops open source archival products, including Archivematica and Atom. Sibyl Schaefer is Digital Preservation Analyst at the University of California, San Diego, and until recently was Head of Digital Programs at the Rockefeller Archive Center. And James Shulman is president of ARTstor, an organization that provides content tools, services to over 1,500 colleges, universities, and other institutions around the world. So with that, I'll let this panel get started and turn it over to Dan.
Thanks so much, Tom. It's good to be here with Tom. Last week, the New Yorker had an article on NASA's preparation for a human landing on Mars, which is supposed to take place sometime in the 2030s. Hopefully I'll still be alive. And it's, of course, a huge undertaking, but what the article focused on was what it would take to get a half dozen humans there and back, and this is the important point, without killing each other. Now, of course, 2 decades from now, many things will change. Engineering will change over the next 2 decades, but I thought what NASA astrobiologist Chris McKay said was really important. The technology is surely going to change, but they'll be the same humans as we have now. And that struck me as extremely profound. The engineering will change, the technology will change, but the human beings will remain the same. Thanks to IMLS, we stand here talking about the National Digital Platform, which is really a transformative idea. I think it is, in fact, the Martian landing for libraries, archives, and museums in the United States. A very powerful and exciting idea. And the technology that relates to that platform will indeed change over time, but the humans will remain the same. And it's a belief that I really do wake up with every day working at the Digital Public Library of America, which I always say is as much a social construction as it is a technical one. We launched 2 years ago. We just celebrated our 2nd birthday. And we're working really at scale across the country. We've made tremendous progress in the engineering and in the collaboration. We just surpassed 10 million openly available items from 1,600 contributing institutions. So we're really at a very gratifying point here 2 years in. But I think what's most gratifying about it is, in fact, some of these human factors. I think collaboration is incredibly hard. It's hard for us not to kill each other and to be oppositional with each other. James Neal cautioned against polygamy, I believe, on the last panel. And what I would say is DPLA isn't polygamous, but we are polyamorous. And so we want to, in fact, engage a community and have community input. DPLA Fest in Indianapolis last week, we had 350 people there, librarians, museum professionals, archivists. Yes, archivists were there. We had members of the public, historians, scholars, so many different kinds of people there. And I think that community, the fact that this exists now in 2015, I think is, in fact, the most important thing that DPLA has been able to instantiate. Having said that, of course, there are important engineering challenges, and there are things related to the hubs that are important, they're related to the DPLA that are important in terms of the model. We do have, in fact, a decentralized model. We are not consolidating, to use Brewster Kahl's ominous word. We're instead creating, I think Tom's word, an ecosystem where we have hubs across the United States, especially state-based service hubs that act as little mini DPLAs in their state to bring online the small collections. We don't want to forget about the small places, as Tom noted, but to bring them all together. And we've been very fortunate to get funding from IMLS and National Endowment for the Humanities and the Sloan Foundation and the Knight Foundation and others to spin up these local hubs so we can, in fact, have a collaborative, decentralized model that all works together. So we're pleased with the progress, but there's clearly much more to do. And I think here engineering is important. As astronauts are fond of saying, leaky spaceships are suboptimal. They don't say that, but I'm saying that. I'm sure they say that at some point. So how can we make the engineering, I guess, more safer for humans, more easy to use so that people don't, in fact, kill each other? Here, I think what we're trying to do, at least at DPLA, is many of the things that have already been laid out on the table. We want to make sure that there are parallel systems in the ecosystem. We want people to have local variations, but we want them to work together and to be interoperable. We want to make the workflows better. Mark Mattienzo, our Director of Technology, is here, and his team are really working on streamlining all the processes that relate to digital platforms, how the data gets interchanged with each other, how we normalize data across multiple institutions. We need to have that all work together. Internationally, we want that to all work together. We also want things to be modular. A lot of our code bases are extremely modular, where people can make changes, can work on little bits of it, but again, have it work together in a very webby way. Again, not consolidation, but collaboration in an ecosystem. Others in the room are doing important work. I'm delighted to look across the room and see so many collaborators. In fact, most of the people in the room I think we're collaborating with. If you're not collaborating with us, dan@dp.la, you can send me an email. And we're excited to work with you more in the future to share our cultural heritage in a maximal way with the public. Thanks.
Okay, yes, I'm Evelyn McClellan from Artefactual Systems, and my background is in the open source software development community, specifically Archivematica and Atom, so I'm going to be speaking a lot from my own experience. The last few years have seen phenomenal growth in the number and sophistication of open source software tools that are available for libraries and archives. And I realized when I started preparing for this meeting that I actually have a very hard time keeping a handle on everything that's out there. So to help me prepare, I went to the excellent FOSS4Lib site, that's free and open source software for lib site hosted by Lyrasis, which is dedicated to listing available open source software tools and providing updates on releases. That site lists a total of 223 open source software tools for use by libraries, which is an astonishing number. And from my perspective as an Archivematica project participant, there are actually a lot more open source tools out there that we integrate into the Archivematica suite that aren't necessarily for standalone use in libraries and archives. So this is an astonishing number, but it made me think, how many institutions are actually successfully preserving their digital holdings and making them available online? And I'm thinking libraries and archives here. I may sound like I'm about to provide an answer to this, but actually I'm not. I have no idea, and I'm not sure exactly how I would find out. And I guess a related question is this: for those institutions successfully undertaking these tasks, what percentage of their digital holdings are they managing to preserve and provide access to? And my belief, based on anecdotal evidence, is that there's an awful lot of digitized content that is not adequately preserved, and that born digital content is being acquired at a sometimes alarming rate, but is neither being preserved or made accessible. So I've been asked to comment on what makes for a successful open source project or service, and here I'm going to fall back on my personal experience a little bit. The first thing is functionality, which sounds like a no-brainer. The software's got to work and it's got to fill a need. Speaking as someone in software development, I can tell you it's actually very difficult to figure out what it is exactly the users need and what the software should do. It's not that easy. The second thing is a long-range plan for supporting and continuing to develop the software. And I think in the past we've seen some grant-funded projects where there's been a tool produced, but when the grant ends, the project kind of goes away. Software requires an unbelievable amount of TLC just to keep going. The third thing is community support and documentation, and the importance and enormity of this task cannot be understated. At Artefactual, I find that we're often just a little bit behind on our documentation that we provide for our software, and sometimes a lot behind. We put all of our end-user documentation and all of our technical documentation online, and it requires a great deal of effort just to keep that up to date. We also run 2 public discussion lists, one for Archivematica and one for Atom. And we try to encourage users of these lists to answer each other's questions, but we find that we end up answering quite a few of the questions. Users come there for technical support or to ask questions about functionality, and we end up answering the questions, and particularly when it comes to Archivematica, which is, it's kind of a technical and esoteric field. The fourth thing that a successful project requires is the implementation of standards so that the content being preserved and made accessible can be moved between systems or integrated into linked data platforms and initiatives. We had one institution tell us they didn't actually care that Archivematica was open source. What they cared about was the premise and METS implementation and the use of the Library of Congress Bagot specification. So this kind of brings me to my 5th point, which is integration of systems, and we've started to talk a little bit about that. No single software tool does everything. And just because, I should add, just because a software tool is open source doesn't necessarily mean it's interoperable with other systems, open source or not. It actually takes a lot of effort to make two systems talk to each other. We're doing a project currently with the University of Michigan, the Bentley Library there, to integrate Archivematica with ArchiveSpace and DSpace. And one of the things we're very heavily focused on for that project is making sure that the tools integrate not just in a way that meets their processing needs, but in a way that can be used by other institutions. And they're working very hard to talk to other institutions and find out, how would you use ArchiveSpace and Archivematica together? What would you be looking for? And finally, my last point is that there are two kinds of institutions out there, and I'm about to get a red flag here. There are two kinds of institutions out there, and I guess this is my takeaway point. There's institutions that are big and can afford to put developer resources into supporting and developing open source tools and integrating them themselves, but there are a lot of institutions that just need to be consumers of these services and tools. And we have to focus efforts on both the large institutions and the smaller institutions that need these tools.
Hi, can you put the yes, thank you. As Tom mentioned, I'm currently working at the University of California, San Diego, which, as you may know, is a very large institution. That's a fairly recent development. I was asked to join this conversation while I was the head of digital programs at the Rockefeller Archive Center, which is a very small independent archive located about 20 miles north of Manhattan. And it's from that smaller organizational perspective that I'll be kind of representing today. As head of digital programs, I implemented many software programs. I implemented many software programs to aid in our care and management of archival materials, digital archival materials in particular. And our workflow looks something like this. We would receive the materials, whether on some sort of media in which we would image it, or through data transfer. There was descriptive processes that were undertaken, including identifying potentially restricted material and personally identifiable information. The materials were then packaged for preservation, distributed geographically for redundancy, and then provided access to whether that be online or on site. I brought this diagram up not so much to dig into the details, but to show that there's over 7 different systems that we use to process records from accession to access. We chose many of these systems mainly because they had the specific functionality we needed, and we also favored ones that were either more user-friendly or could be configured to be user-friendly. Being an agency dedicated to preserving the study of philanthropy, open source systems always jived more with our ethos. However, if proprietary software had the functionality we needed, we weren't precluded from adopting it. And it's worth noting that these proprietary systems, and there's a couple on the diagram, are expensive and thus not readily available to organizations with smaller budgets. The most important aspect of this diagram is really the arrows connecting the systems. This is where we spent most of our time. Interoperability, and more specifically, the ability to control data flow from one application to another, is an area of high need, as has already been stated here today. This diagram obscures a ton of work in between each point, some of which we were able to automate, some of which we were not. This type of convoluted workflow is not unique to the Archive Center. One tweet from the IMLS focused Twitter conversation the other week sums it up as, there's no sensible way to do accessioning, digitization, preservation, redaction, display. Another aspect of this diagram I'd like to point out is the one-way workflow. Revisioning is so nightmarish that we haven't yet had a use case that passed the threshold where it was warranted. This will change, however, once some of our time-based access embargoes are lifted and the materials need to be made accessible. The diagram also doesn't include our subscription to Archive.it and the web crawl data we collect, mainly because it hasn't yet been figured into the workflow, but I think it's important to recognize that the data is coming in from a lot of different sources. So addressing the questions that we were given prior to this meeting when talking about OSS, and taking it to the next level, interoperability is number 1 on my wish list. I think IMLS could lead the way in bringing together the organizations that are working with OSS in order to learn about each other, foster collaboration and innovation, and discuss the next step in bringing these systems more in sync. The other thing I wanted to highlight was how I determined the division of resources amongst all the programs we use. My staff was pretty small, there were 4 of us in total, but I had a great deal of flexibility in allocating funds for software and software services. One of my goals was to build staff technical competency. So in deciding between allocating time or allocating money, a large part of that decision was influenced by the ecosystem surrounding the OSS and how its development community supported newbies. The software projects that provided the most support and active encouragement for my staff were the ones that we chose to actively work with and adopt. Another recommendation is to provide support for development of guidelines or best practices for how open source software makers should communicate to their varying constituencies. Thanks.
I am physiologically incapable of speaking without pictures. I can do shadow puppets. I will start. Maybe they can help us find my presentation. What I want to do today is talk about. Can't read that, so I'll go to this. I'm going to talk about sort of the arc of a reforming isolationist. And it's not really fair since what we've been doing at ARTstor really has been about being networked all along. But I think what I'm going to talk about are a few projects that we've done that show a path toward an increasingly networked approach to things. And I think, so our original mission and our original goal was to set out to connect content owners and educational users and to create content that would be useful, to bring together and aggregate content that would be useful for people teaching art history or other related fields using visual materials. So we found images from archives and museums and individual scholars and photographers all over the world and brought them together and made them searchable. And just to highlight one thing that Amy Garner said on the previous panel, the need to integrate the local into this networked approach is a very important sociological and ethical issue. So I think all the things that we've talked about today about the diversity of the ecosystem are so important. And I think what Sibyl was just saying about the different pieces of this, some of these are proprietary software, some are open, but the glue that we're talking about today and that IMLS is providing such leadership in doing is saying that that glue in that ecosystem needs to all work together. And so I think that's why we've heard the word ecosystem a couple times. So what we did originally, I'm going to give 3 examples of how things that we've done at ARTstor, even though everything we do is nonprofit, but some of them charge fees, how those have cross-subsidized open things. And I think the increasing utility of those over time. So the first example, ARTstor Digital Library, subscribed to by 1,600 institutions from research universities to small public schools. So through that channel where we were bringing together content and making it available for educational users as a subscription service, the Metropolitan Museum came to us about 5 or 6 years ago and said, we want to make images available for academic publishing. We want to make, for free, we want to provide images for low print run publications. Will you do the fulfillment of that for us? And we said, absolutely. So we used this platform or this channel that we were building to deliver online educational uses for very constrained purposes to open it up to allow for this academic, this distribution of the Met and now 15 other places. They're images that they wanted to give away for no fee, and we give away for no fee, and you don't have to subscribe to ARTstor. So already the platform of ARTstor Digital Library is cross-subsidizing this open content. That's great. But to be honest, it's a little bit of an orphan. It's not in the flow. It's not in a national platform. So it's a really good thing, and I urge you all to go get an image for your article for the Burlington magazine. But it's not in the flow. The next stage, so anyway, the way that works though is you get a password and you go to ARTstor, we give you a password, you get those images, you can fill out a form and download a 20 megabyte TIFF for an academic publication. The next example we have is we've also built a platform called Shared Shelf, which is cloud-based cataloging and asset management services. And so this is really built in response to the silos within institutions where one department uses one software and the map room uses another and the art history uses another and the archaeologists use another and individual faculty members are storing their collections on iPhoto or wherever, and these images aren't getting into the institutional flow or into a shared flow. So this is hopefully a useful services for colleges and universities, and there are about 120 places using it. Has a lot of work on metadata and authority files and controlled vocabularies built in. And so a couple of years ago, Columbia University and the Avery Library, Jim and his colleague Carol Ann Fabian, worked together with us and the Getty Research Institute and got an IMLS grant to build something called the BuiltWorks Registry. The BuiltWorks Registry is an open, messy, sloppy beginnings of an authority file for BuiltWorks, so that everybody in the world, let's skip this, everybody in the world isn't trying to figure out, is it called Falling Water or Falling Water? Or is it the Kaufman House? Or is it in Mill Run, Pennsylvania or Bear Run, Pennsylvania? And so it was to build one record, one stable URI for these. This, of course, is open, but it lives symbiotically on the shared shelf platform. So this, too, this has now been launched, and it's up. It has an API, so it's a big step forward toward being in the flow. Where we fit vocabularies and authorities in this national platform, I think, is still emerging. But this was a step for us where that cross-subsidization was now trying to get things more in the flow. So this is BWR, the BuiltWorks Registry. So the newest stage for us was when the DPLA launched, and we became a hub for it early on. And so we worked with some museums that wanted their content that was in the ARTstor digital library to get in this flow. So now the bridges that were built in those early days weren't made out of steel, they were more rope ladders. And so fortunately with a new IMLS grant, we're gonna be building out the infrastructure, and we're gonna work on standards that are like IIIF and work towards Hydra interoperability, so that all the things, so that this flow of content into DPLA is very much now moving more and more towards the arc of fitting in this national ecosystem.
Okay, thank you all. That was great, and I guess Trevor, I'll start the Q&A. One thing that stood out for me about all of your presentations was not so much the focus on, and I think as Dan set up very well, not so much the focus on technology, but the focus on people. So we're talking about what's the best word, you know, should we be using ecosystem, platform, cyber infrastructure, you know, which of these words is most appropriate? You know, I think we could also say that it's people, right? It's like, you know, the national digital platform is made of people. And it seems that, you know, Dan, you were talking about the kind of organizational challenges of getting all of your partners together and working together to form that kind of community. Evelyn, you were talking about the importance of the community to provide documentation, support, kind of help functions. And Sibyl, you were talking about the kind of idiosyncrasies that all institutions have in their processes, and that, you know, in some respects, I think we want to support those kinds of idiosyncrasies. And this gets back to some of the issues I think that we were talking about in the Q&A in the last panel. And I'm wondering if anybody has anything to say about how, while we build this national digital platform, we can continue to support the kind of idiosyncratic. Because I think that is, I mean, the richness of our field is really in the idiosyncrasies of individual institutions, of individual practitioners, of individual collections. And so while we try to collaborate and work together and interoperate, how we can at the same time support idiosyncrasy.
I got an idea.
Mike, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I got that one covered.
Mike will jump in and answer my question.
See me during a break. I got that all covered. I'm Michael Edson. I work at the Smithsonian, but I'm here for CLEAR, where I'm a fellow in the Open Knowledge Foundation. Trevor and I have talked for years we've talked about the process of edge to core. So back in the old days, If you wanted something cool to happen in your organization, you'd sort of, you put down the gates and you do a retreat and you get the smart people in the room and you would define the problem, you'd architect the solution, your staff would build it, and then you'd deliver it to a passive and grateful public. And that doesn't work anymore because the kind of the perimeter of the innovation environment is so freaking huge now, it dwarfs the scale of almost any institution we can think of. So when we architected the Smithsonian strategy back in a long time, in 2009, we tried to turn that into an asset. We said the most interesting things in any given domain are happening in the border habitat between institutions in the 20th century sense and everybody else in the world. That's where it happens in nature. That's where you get the most biodiversity. And that those border habitats are where you have well-defined problems, which are normally come from people, some subject matter expertise, some technological prowess, and some level of platform with a lowercase p. And so the process for an organization like the digital platform, the IMLS, or any of our institutions, if you want to make something interesting happen, is to diversify your portfolio of attention away from exclusive focus on your own stuff and more towards that border habitat. And you develop the process of scanning the edge for the solutions that are cropping up naturally. Have you all read Without Their Permission by Alexis Ohanian? It talks about permissionless innovation being faster, more potent than industrial innovation. So the process is edge to core. Devote some number of human hours and focus and attention and mind share of this project to scanning that perimeter, relieving the edge innovators of the burden of supporting their own platform, of keeping HR and payroll and their own teams going. Bring the aspects that can be successful into the middle where they can scale. And then release the hounds, encourage the rest of that ecosystem to keep going. That's going to move faster than anything.
So let me throw this back to the panel. We've got several people on the panel who are supporting kind of some core institutions or core infrastructure of the National Digital Platform, the DPLA, Archivematica, ARTstor. These are, I think we'd all agree, kind of core components of the National Digital Platform. How, as core central components, are your institutions, your projects, doing that work of scanning the periphery for good work, for inspiration, for innovation, for contribution, and supporting that richness at the nodes?
I'll try something. So I'm reminded of Josh Greenberg's dissertation where he wrote about how you need translators, and if you're living in the borders, you need people who can speak both languages. And so obviously that's very practical in terms of standards. We all think in those terms, but just in terms of respecting cultures and being able to translate. And so we work with a big diversity of institutions, and as those other communities that we end up talking to have languages that we understand and we can speak in, that's when we can start to be useful. So when IIIF emerges, out of Stanford and Oxford and the other colleagues working on this is a standard for interoperability of images. It makes so much sense. And so for us to get in that conversation, we have to be able to speak, we have to be able to listen, and so it's a translation activity too.
Dan?
Yeah, I'll add, I thought Sibyl's point about the arrows is really key. That is the borders there and how you get things from what really should be a very diverse set of institutions and operations and all those things. Also, at the same time, being able to commingle and allow for innovation between those institutions, I think, is really key. So DPLA tries to handle some of those little arrows that are really important. There's a lot of behind-the-scenes work we do, for instance, on the normalization of the data, where we understand we've got 1,600 institutions, and those range from very small historical societies up to the Smithsonian. And so we need to combine all those things. So we act as that little arrow, I think, between those environments, allowing for diversity while also acting as the translator, and then allowing for something to happen at scale, which you can't do if you're just simply tiny little islands spread around.
I think we've talked a little bit about local idiosyncrasies versus what what general needs are. And I think we have to be careful when we look at local idiosyncrasies to figure out how idiosyncratic they really are, because I think what one institution might consider a unique problem is actually a problem that a lot of other institutions have. And I think it's important for institutions to get together and talk about what it is they're trying to do. For example, we worked with a couple of institutions that needed to preserve forensic disks. And it turned out that their needs were actually very similar. So I would ask an institution that says, we are a special snowflake, we have these very specific needs, are you really that different? And if you're that different, maybe that's a little bit of a problem, and you should take a look at what it is you're trying to do and how you're trying to do it.
Great. So these hub institutions can also be facilitators between the more local, more idiosyncratic institutions. Great. I think we have a question over here.
My name is Micah Man. I'm with the New York Public Library. This is a question that I think would have been good for the last panel. I think it's good for you too. I think it's going to come up all day. And it's really, I'm thrilled to see us as a group embracing this idea of the networked solution and the idea of building on 20 years of experimentation, recognizing that we're not starting from zero. And I think what emerges from this is a vision for this sort of patchwork quilt of solutions, where different kinds of institutions build a part of the solution and we stitch it together. So New York Public Library is an institution that's 100 years old or more, a little more, and is intensely local, even though we're a large institution. And so I guess my question is, as some of you are representing DPLA being, to me, the standout that I'm most familiar with, but all of you, institutions that are trying to build this national platform, my question is, do we have the right institutions already? Do we need new ones, or do the ones that exist need to evolve? Because I think there is always going to be some tension with, certainly a public library is a great example, funded by local taxpayers with an intentionally local mission. And there's always this struggle and this trade-off between serving our core local mission and building something that's going to be useful at the core. So moving your project from the fringe use case you were excited about to something that's national in scale. And so I guess as we continually wrestle with that, I think we can make tremendous progress by taking experiments that have been done at that fringe and scaling them up. But I also wonder if we have the right kinds of institutions. So, looking at DPLA being brand new and an institution that was designed to fit in the world of the web and in this time and this way. So my question is, do we expand some of these institutions to be broader, or is this not really a problem? Is it possible for that patchwork quilt to really grow into something that is holistic and seamless?
Dan, do you want to?
Sure. So, I think it's very important when thinking about participation and the kinds of organizations that should be involved, that we rely not purely on goodwill, but on narcissism. I think narcissism is a very important motivator, and so I always try to think in terms of social psychology of this, of why institutions would want to participate with something like DPLA, or when are there new organizations or technologies or platforms that might be needed to enable those local institutions to say, hey, we really need that, right? I think that thinking through that social psychology is very important. And I think for DPLA, we are trying, in effect, to provide a lot of value and a lot of services to a variety of institutions where they can, again, still maintain autonomy, all those things. We're not sucking them dry and taking their stuff and leaving their, the local institutions to not have any role. Clearly, they have very important roles at the center of their communities in the case of public libraries, but we do allow them then to connect into this massive infrastructure, right? And I think the other panelists as well, they're enabling new functionality that really does add value that these institutions can choose to be a part of. New York Public Library, I think our collaboration with New York Public Library is really wonderful in that it's bi-directional, right? You have a digital collection that we're also providing discovery for. And recently, when you redesign your digital collection space, there's a wonderful link right on the digital collection space to say, hey, find this at DPLA. You could find more things like these items, which enables New York Public, which is this wonderful institution and has many audiences in New York and around the world, but it allows you to connect into 1,599 other institutions and their holdings and what they have. So that gives you tremendous value to, in a sense, have us as a broker for what you're doing and to leverage that. So I think continually thinking about that kind of, why should we participate? What are the incentives here? And again, the narcissism part rather than pure, I love goodwill, it's great, But we want people to find the value in that, and DPLA is certainly working really hard to articulate that value.
If I could, I really like the metaphor of the patchwork quilt, and you said, you know, there are these pieces that we need to stitch together, and it occurs to me that the stitching is provided by sort of the people on the ground in the institutions, and you know, Sibyl mentioned that when you choose these kind of open platforms over spending a lot of money on a proprietary platform, what you're really doing is not really choosing a cost savings, it's you're choosing to invest your money in your people to get them trained and to get them involved in an open source community and learn how to use those technologies. And I wonder, Sibyl, if you could say a little bit about the kind of challenges that a smaller institution that is involved in these larger digital initiatives faces in training staff and getting staff. We're going to have a panel on that later on today, but I wonder if you could say a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, it is quite tricky. For a while, we didn't even have enough money. Well, we never really had enough money to hire a full-time developer, and so being an archive, I felt that the most core background was really education and archival studies to apply that archival theory, and really steep in archival was essential. And then to kind of pick up the tech skills as they went along, and it really depended on the open source software and what documentation was available, and how responsive developers were, and how they responded was actually quite critical, because you can respond and give a helpful answer that helps a user actually learn how to do something versus just kind of being dismissive or doing it for them. And I think the successful software programs really have that kind of teaching element to them. So they work with the constituencies to say, okay, this is how you file a bug report. This is how you develop a user story, and you kind of work with the actual group. So you educate them as they participate in the program. So.
More?
So,
Is that?
it's Amy.
Oh, Amy, I saw long blonde hair. Sorry. Hi, Amy.
So Amy Garmer from the Aspen Institute. I just wanted to respond to the last commenter who raised this question of, do we need institutions to transform? Do we need new types of institutions? And I think certainly at the local level, we need the institutions to transform. And that part of that is understanding that the job of the institution is no longer just to curate the rest of the world for the community, but that they are, in fact, curating the community for the rest of the world. And that's part of the, not just incentive, but that's part of the job that they need to be doing.
Excellent. Other questions or comments? If I could throw a comment over to, or a question over to Evelyn, sort of building on Sibyl's remarks. So if we're thinking about the staff as being the thread that helps to stitch together this patchwork quilt, I know in working on projects, open source software projects myself on Omeka and Zotero, one of the most dreaded questions I think that you can get in the developer forums or in the help forums are, I'm trying to make Omeka work with this other thing that, of course, your staff doesn't have any knowledge of or expertise in, or what role can the providers of open source software tools for libraries, archives, and museums, what do you have strategies for helping make those connections to other software? It's one thing to answer questions about your own product, but to answer questions about how your product works with another. Do you have strategies for dealing with that kind of a problem? Not to put you on the spot or anything.
It's hard because in the discussion list we get so many questions about why doesn't your software do this, or will it work with this? And I feel like our software should do everything. And we often have to answer, we would love it if our software could do that, but we would be looking for funding. which is not a very satisfactory answer. But we try to connect users with other software packages as often as we can, but often the best thing is when other users jump in and answer the questions that are asked by the first users, and we really like to see that, because we don't know all the answers. We're just one small group of people, and if we can encourage the people on our discussion list to talk to each other, we've seen some great back and forth conversations, especially between large institutions that have a lot of resources and large-scale implementations. I love it when they jump in and they answer a question from a small institution and say, this is what we did, and it worked for us, and you can look at this tool, and you can do other things. And I guess, I mean, this is kind of a diffuse answer, but I guess what I like to see is knowledge flowing down from the larger institutions to the smaller institutions, because I really think we need that, because there are some really fantastic things going on. There's a lot of great work that's being done in digital preservation and access, and I feel sometimes like the smaller institutions are just shut out.
Other questions from the audience?
Just a gloss on that. One of the wonderful things that happened at TPLA Fest last week is that there were, in fact, directors of major university libraries in the same room with the heads of small public libraries. There were people from big museums and small historical societies in the same room. And you know, in my career, I've found those kinds of discussions, they're very, very elusive. You know, there are conferences that bring together you know, research libraries. I think, in fact, the Association of Research Libraries is meeting as we talk, and that's great, and those folks need to get together, but it's very rare to have knowledge dissemination occur across some of these boundaries, and I think IMLS and others in the room can play a real role in sort of facilitating that kind of conversation. I certainly hope TPLA Fest can do that.
Karen from WGBH. I would like to speak to Evelyn's comment about how do you get smaller institutions to be able to contribute to the larger, bigger institutions. For example, I may have one or two developers that I could add to a sprint or some kind of development work, but there needs to be better ways to engage them into that larger community so that they are helping build something that will then help them locally. And I think Hydra is working really hard to do that, which is great, but there's still a lot of work that needs to happen in order to really fully engage those smaller institutions, and for the smaller institutions to really feel like they're contributing.
Well, this is, I mean, I meant to mention it during my talk, but I'm so excited about the Hydra in the Box project, which is fantastic because Hydra is a great tool. And so far, really, the only institutions that have been able to use Hydra are the large university libraries where they have a core of developers to develop Hydra gems, and they're doing great things. But to see this, this possibility down the road of having literally an easy-to-install Hydra instance that has, you know, a lot of functionality for lots of institutions to use, I think is very, very exciting, and it's great because it's a collaboration between you know, three major organizations: DPLA, Duraspace, and Stanford. So I think this is one of the most exciting projects I've seen in a while.
And along with that, I'm on the technical advisory committee for Archive Space, and that actual question came up with somebody who basically said, I have developers, I want to contribute to sprints, but I want to contribute to sprints where we're actually interested in that development. And so I think the number one thing an open source software group can put out there is a roadmap of what these sprints are going to be and what functionality they're planning. And that's very helpful even for small organizations too. They're waiting for some functionality to be developed to actually know when they can expect it, because that influences decisions.
I'll ask a question that's something I was wondering about this morning. You know, it occurs to me that a central element of the National Digital Platform, especially for smaller institutions, but even for individual users at larger institutions, and something that's not really represented here, and maybe should be, are consumer services, right? Consumer web services like Dropbox or Google Docs, or I mean, I know that we like to, and I've done it myself in the marketing for our open source tools, talk about things being easy to use or in a box. I've used both of those phrases before, but what do we really mean by easy to use? I mean, like a good example, Omeka. It's easy to use compared to some other enterprise systems, but it's not really easy to use like Dropbox is easy to use. And I think especially when we're talking about a range of institutions where I think Dropbox really is pretty easy to use for everybody, although not really for my mother. I had to give my mother a Dropbox tutorial recently. How do we maybe integrate with some of those really truly easy to use systems and bring them into this conversation? Because I do think that those are the tools that a lot of very, very small institutions, if they are using digital tools and digital workflows, they're making heavy use of some of these commercial services, as we all do.
Well, I mean, I'll jump in and say here's where things like APIs help out a lot. So I'm not going to give your mom an API tutorial, but I will give a tutorial to a third-party developer that can integrate, for instance, DPLA and DPLA collections to services like Twitter, Facebook, et cetera. So I think there, again, that notion of bridge, I think Sibyl's notion of the arrows is very important. And I think one of the values that DPLA provides is even if you're a small collection, you now have an API through DPLA, right? Your collections can be accessible, knitted together, arrows in multiple directions because you have participated in this national network. And I think that's really a kind of signature sort of aspect to any kind of national digital platform.
Shared APIs.
Cliff Lynch from CNI. I may be just trying to get at the question you just asked from a somewhat different perspective, but I'd be interested in some comments on this. We've heard quite a bit of discussion already about the barriers to participation for smaller institutions that have very limited IT resources. We've also heard quite a lot of discussion about open source software and things of that nature. I actually wonder if the national platform or this portfolio of resources, particularly as viewed by smaller institutions, is going to be much more about services. That really the idea is going to be there are services available out on the network that hopefully work together in some kind of cohesive way, whereby really a lot of the smaller institutions can avoid a good deal of the IT detail by just using these services. And so I guess I'd invite some reflection about the balance of software and services. Certainly when I look at what's going on in other areas of information technology, especially with smaller organizations, we see a massive shift of IT from locally mounted services. Locally mounted systems out into a services world.
James?
So with our IMLS funded project, that's very much our goal. So our goal is to take this platform, this core platform that we built, Shared Shelf, and to make it available as free and open services for small institutions to use it to contribute to a national flow. And I think over the years, with various funders, I think it's been a lot of progress for people to realize. So we'll make the code for those components open source, but we're not working to build an open source software there. We're working to build components of a free service. And that free service will go to the small museum, and that's why we're working with, we have some large museums in the group that got the grant with us and with DPLA. But we also have the Staten Island Museum, and we have the El Paso Museum of Art. And we're not looking for some group that's going to have three people to integrate and interoperate and make it work with their digital asset management and their collections management, and spit out a solar index, and if need be, just write a little Perl script to do this. We really think that what we need to do is provide an on-ramp that's easy. And I think when we talk about a national digital platform or a national platform, I mean, we all think often of the federal highway system, which has rules. Here's how you get on. You don't have a stop sign at the end of your ramp, And so, I very much think that that's going to be a key part of getting people in the game.
I talked briefly about the enormous growth in the number of open source software tools over the last 5 years or so. I'm hoping that over the next 5 years, we'll be talking about the enormous growth in hosting services and hubs and networks and things like DeepIn and, expansion of services provided by DPLA, because it literally, for some institutions, they are not looking at open source tools. They're not thinking about tools, they're thinking about their needs and what services they can get. And from my perspective, I'm happy to develop the open source tools, and I hope that they get integrated into platforms and services that these institutions can use, because they're not going to download and use Archivematica in their own institution.
One of the reasons we're so grateful to have gotten IMLS funding along with Stanford and DuraSpace on the hubs in a box idea is in fact that idea that it could be hosted remotely for institutions that don't want to devote developer time, et cetera, or can't develop it themselves. Obviously, we're creating open source software. We've got great partners, I think, and it'll be terrific to have this out there and to be able to be deployable in that way. But I also think it presents the opportunity as Cliff notes for a service-based operation as well.
Jim Neal, Columbia. Because this is an IMLS-sponsored event, we have focused in this conversation about the state of a distributed national capacity. I wonder if the panelists would talk a little bit about the state of an expanded global capacity. How do we fit into a larger platform which is global and far more diverse than US-centric issues that we're talking about today?
James, do you want to start?
Well, I think that these border conversations need common languages and need translators, as I was saying before. I think Dan can speak to the work that he does regularly and DPLA does across with other national libraries, and I think that's sort of the level of supra-aggregation, and then there's the micro level of letting people in the game, and I think those rules of invitation and correspondence are very much the same around the world. I mean, the intellectual property rules are different, and and the languages are different. So those are things, those are added modules that we have to figure out, and that will slow down some flows. But as you say, there's certainly no reason that those handshakes aren't extended at the micro institutional level.
So, Jim, it's happening right now. I mean, it is happening. Right now, it's the 100th anniversary of the Great War, the First World War. DPLA's data, which is completely interoperable with Europeana's and Digital NZ in New Zealand and Trove in Australia, is all combined right now in a large exhibition of hundreds of thousands of items that Europeana's mounted, and they were able to mount that because of this seamless interoperability. So, these are just the first steps, but I think that project alone, it's called Europeana 1914 to 1918, is incredibly suggestive, and I think there'd be a great role for IMLS and others in the room to facilitate more of these conversations that I have regularly with folks around the world, my counterparts at other national and international digital library projects. I think there's tremendous potential to, in a sense, bootstrap into a global digital library through these methods.
Mark here, I'm sorry, Mike in front.
Tom, you mentioned linked open data in the first few sentences. Could you speak a little bit more about it?
Me?
Anyone.
Why don't I open up to the panelists? Anyone want to tackle linked open data?
Right. I might pass the mic to Mark Matienzo, but I will say it is an area of extreme interest for DPLA. I think, again, here's another role that we can play, is that a lot of institutions can't slot in linked data into their data payloads. And so one of the things that we can do as part of the normalization and enhancement of the 1,600 institutions' data is, in fact, to add in linked data as part of that process. Their data is now super enhanced. It's connected in new ways across institutions nationally and indeed internationally through linked data IDs. And so it's an area where we're going to work really hard at DPLA to get going. And in fact, if you look at our latest metadata application profile 4.0, which you all should read immediately, there is in fact a significant portion of that that's devoted to linked data. So it's definitely on our radar.
Mark, you want to?
Sure. I'm Mark Matienzo. I'm the Director of Technology at DPLA. I kind of wanted to follow up on something that was just said before about sort of Jim's question about how things happen in the international context. I mean, I think with representation on the panel and those of us in the room, I mean, I don't want to just toot DPLA's horn or the horn of the Hydra project, but we have made a lot of progress in starting to connect with Europeana on multiple levels. So the DPLA metadata application profile is built on the Europeana data model. So we are a participant in discussions in data modeling. We now have succeeded in getting Europeana to contribute to data modeling efforts within the Hydra community quite significantly, which is a very, very recent development. And they're showing continued interest in sort of related and allied projects such as Blacklight and Spotlight. So also similarly, Archivematica, has a international community of users. And so, it's sort of, when we think about the international community, I think we need to figure out what our plans are. I mean, from my perspective, it's specifically around interoperability and sort of not repeating effort around data modeling where it's not necessary. Going back to what Evelyn said before, is I think this notion of idiosyncrasies is kind of somewhat problematic because they're not really idiosyncrasies. Like, if we start to see this problem at multiple places, this is a problem that exists at scale. The types of things that Sibyl were talking about is really an international problem for a lot of archives that are working with digital material. So, just because we start to feel the friction in our own institutions about where these workflows fail, that that indicates a larger scale problem that often exists on an international level.
So, Vicki Reich, Stanford. Another aspect of collaboration is the web archiving community. And IIPC is at Stanford while Tom and I are here and not at that meeting. And that is truly international. You have the national libraries doing web archiving. You have the smaller libraries doing web archiving through Archive.it and through other tools. And so I want to make sure it doesn't get lost that, again, having APIs, and Dan mentioned this, and I would love Dan to come give a tutorial to my mother, please. Having APIs so that the tools that are being used to capture and preserve and disseminate and to manage the web published content would be very, very important. And to make those tools easy to use so that the people that Sibyl is talking about, the folks at the local level, can get their government documents, the town government documents, and preserve them and make them available would be just huge.
I think that's a great place for us to call it. We thank you so much for talking about where we are now, the state of distributed national digital capacity. We will come back in 20 minutes or so and talk about the gaps, which is always more fun, to talk about what we need still, and that's where we're obviously very interested. So thank you all. Let's give them a round of applause for their help.